It's important to recognize that water is a human right because there are so many people in the world now who cannot, because they cannot afford water, are being denied water. It's actually, if you look at the strict numbers, it's probably the greatest human rights issue of our time in terms of how many people do not have access to clean water. And in pretty well every case, if they had money, they would be able to buy water. It's either been privatized or it's too expensive, even if it's public, for them to access. You know, we had a successful resolution adopted by the United Nations in 2010 after many years of work to get this. And, you know, people said, well, it's not going to overnight, everything's not going to be all right, of course, and that's absolutely true. But I think it's incredibly important when the world community makes a decision that something is a fundamental human right and that they're going to take, countries are required and governments are required to take certain steps to make it real. And so the process has begun of implementation in many countries, and we've actually seen a number of areas of success where there has been, the resolution has been used in a successful way. Canada led the fight. Under the Harper government, Canada led the fight against the human right to water. It was an appalling thing and a very embarrassing thing for me because I was the senior advisor on water to the 63rd President of the United Nations, and it was through that process that the impetus came for this to come to fruition. And people would say to me at the United Nations, but your own government's not supporting it. It was just very embarrassing. Canada was the last holdout. Canada has now adopted the human right to water because all of the governments of the world adopted this right at the Rio +20 statement, the statement that they signed there. But Canada was absolutely the last holdout and led the fight against it. I think there are several reasons why the Harper government didn't support and actually opposed the human right to water. One is the appalling state of water services in First Nations communities in Canada, which is a federal responsibility, and I don't think they wanted to give that tool to First Nations. As well, I just don't think they like the concept of enlarging the concept of human rights. They want them to be very narrowly defined, and so this isn't the only human rights issue that the Harper government has fought. We've really regressed on the international stage in terms of the view of the world of Canada as a human rights advocate, as an advocate for social justice. It's been a real step back for us, and this was a very embarrassing and poor show on the part of our government. Well, it's really interesting. We talk about water as a human right, and we talk about water as a public trust, which is kind of another way of saying not only is it an individual human right, but it belongs to all of us. We are all stewards of it, and nobody has the right to own it or profit from it at the expense of someone else. But if you extend it even further, one can say, but water also has rights. Aside from its usefulness to us, because humans, even the best of us, tend to see nature and water as a resource for our personal convenience and maybe profit and pleasure and so on. But when you say no, water and watersheds have rights beyond their usefulness to us, outside of human existence, that's a whole new concept, and it's a very exciting concept, and one that I believe you're going to hear a lot more about. We're kind of taking these things a step at a time. The human right to water is a public trust. And now more and more talk about having to adopt and adapt our laws, which basically see water as a property, to be more compatible with the natural laws of watersheds and of nature. Because if we don't do this, I mean, we're in a collision course with history if we don't change our ways. I mean, we're sitting here, I'm looking out at Lake Huron, and I can see where the water line used to come to, and I can see where it is now. And people who live here say that they can watch the lake recede every year. Now, something's deeply, powerfully wrong with that reality. And until we start to say, this lake doesn't exist to serve us, but rather it is these lakes, these wonderful lakes, and water around the world is the most important element of a living ecosystem that gives us all life. And we have got to change our heads around. We have to see it very differently. I call it a new water ethic, where we put water in the center of our lives, and we ask on every kind of policy, whether it's energy or food policy, trade policy, environmental, you name it, economic policy, we ask what's its impact on water. And if its impact on water is negative, then we have to rethink it, because we can't in the world that we're living in, with declining water stocks and a demand going straight up, I mean, literally, if you see the charts, the demand's going straight down, the supply is going, or sorry, up, the supply is going straight down, then you see what we're dealing with. And it's absolutely impossible for us to say, well, it's just, you know, business as usual. It's not business as usual. There's a wonderful man named Cormac Cullinan who has written a book called Wild Law. He's a South African environmental human rights lawyer. And he and others have started to express the need for a new body of law that would make our human laws more compatible with the laws of nature. And he was the principal architect of a new statement, a declaration on the rights of Mother Earth that we all adopted in Cochabamba, Bolivia in 2010, following the failure of the climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009. We said that's not working. Whatever governments are doing is not working. And so many thousands of us came together in Bolivia and came up with this declaration. And basically it names the rights that water would have and the rights that nature would have, much the way the 1948 Universal Declaration on the Rights of on Human Rights names what rights humans have. And people will joke and say, "Oh, you're saying now you can't go fishing," and we're saying, no, nobody's saying that, but we are saying you cannot fish a species to extinction. Nobody's saying you can't, you know, take water from a watershed for some industrial commercial use, but you cannot destroy the watershed in doing so. And so it's placing a limit, a very strict limit on what we can do to water for ourselves, because we think that, you know, as I say, that this water is for us. It's not. And so it's really turning the whole concept around and giving communities, and we're very much wanting this to be community-based, the right to have local ordinances or local bylaws which say we don't want fracking here, we don't want that bottled water industry here, we don't want nuclear deep deposits in this area, we don't want them anywhere, but we're the people who live here and we don't want them here. And we're doing it not just for our human health, but we're doing it to protect the watershed, and we're doing it to protect the natural environment here because we consider it important. And if we live here, we have not only the right to care, we have the responsibility to care, and we have the responsibility to take action and not wait for, I don't know, some government to do it when we know they're not very likely to do it at the moment. Well, this is a project that we work on, a Council of Canadians, with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and it's to get municipal governments to commit to keeping water as a public good, as a public trust. So a blue community, to become a blue community, a municipality has to agree to the notion that water is a human right, which of course, since now it is officially, it's not a hard thing for them to do, but it's important to name it, that water is a public trust, and that they will not provide bottled water on their premises or at their conventions and public events and so on, that they promote public water. And why would they be there promoting bottled water? That's actually the sticky one in a lot of communities. They're okay on the first two, but we have a number of municipalities, particularly in Ontario, that have adopted the notion of being a blue community, and we're hoping that this is going to go international, and it's going to start in Switzerland, with Bern about to become the first international blue community. So this is a way, you know how municipalities can call themselves green, or a building can be green certified or LEED certified or whatever. This is a way that communities can take a step to say we will protect water. I'd like it to grow because I think it could be also a commitment to protecting the water itself. You know, at the moment it's water as a human right and so on, but I'd like it eventually to go beyond to that notion that these waters have rights and we have to coexist with the water. Not just the other way around, is not taking care of it so we have it, but rather we take care of it because water gives us life. Well, the very good question is when you get these mixed demands for a resource like fish, from commercial to sports to First Nations rights and so on, often it's all seen as what are our rights to that what we consider a resource, instead of saying, well, this is a species, and that we need, it is incredibly important not only to protect the species, but the habitat for the species. I'm very, very disturbed that the Harper government has removed most of the protections for water, fresh water in Canada. I don't think people understand how devastating and how across the board this is. From the Fisheries Act, the gutting of the Fisheries Act, to the gutting of the Navigable Waters Protection Act, to the gutting of our Environmental Assessment Act. They have put basically 99% of all rivers and lakes in Canada in jeopardy. They have no protection. The fisheries have no protection unless they're commercial. So not only do we not have good rules for saying, when we have these disputes about a particular fishery like salmon or whatever, not only do we not now have a good way of understanding how to protect them and try to give access to various groups, now we've got the government saying it doesn't matter at all, and you can just fish them to extinction. I don't care who takes, there's no protection for their habitat. I don't care who takes them at all. Not only do we have these local issues in places like Owen Sound, but we don't have the national protections anymore that people can turn to and say, you're putting poison into that water. That is, under the Fisheries Act, that's a crime. It's no longer a crime unless you can prove that it's a viable commercial fishery. So we're doing, not doing the right things, we're doing all of the wrong things, and we need to turn it around and say that not only does water have rights, not only is water a public trust, but we need a fundamental new water ethic, and we have to reverse, and any new government that comes in must make this as a priority. We must reverse the cuts to these protections for our fresh water in this country, because, and I tell you, when you look at the statistics and the reality of what's happening with fresh water around the world, we have a responsibility in this country with these beautiful lakes, with our rivers and so on, to take care of them, because the world is running out of available fresh water really, really fast. Just one stat that came across my desk just days ago, and that is that since 1990, half of the rivers in China are gone. Half of the rivers in China are gone. Try to get your head around what we're dealing with here. It's for mostly for coal-fired hydroelectricity production, but also for all the, their industrial production of so many goods and so on that's just destroying their rivers. When we wantonly destroy our water sources like this, we simply don't understand that there are limits to nature. There are certainly limits to fresh water. It's less than 1% of all the water in the world is available fresh water. You destroy it, you dump it into the ocean, you pollute it, you move it around in trade, in goods. I mean, a lot of our water is stuck in plastic everywhere forever. I mean, it was used to make whatever, and it's still there. We don't get that. We still have this, what I call this myth of abundance, that it'll never go away. It will never run out. And I can tell you, from traveling around the world looking at water, and from writing a great deal and reading a great deal, we are a planet in crisis. And we in Canada, and we around these lakes, and we in local communities where there still is water, have a particular responsibility to take care of it. Well, in very many communities around the world, it's the responsibility still of women to find water. So it's women and their girl children who will walk kilometers to find a pipe or a well or whatever, a river source, and then very often they come back without it. We've seen a rise in violence against women as a result of the scarcity of water. Women are responsible very often for their family's health, for the gardens, for producing the food and so on, all of which need water. So it's not that men don't suffer as well, but it kind of hits first and foremost. It hits women. It's very, very much a women's issue. And of course the girl children are taken out of school to go with their mothers to get water. So when we fix a water situation in a particular community, we are also freeing the girls up to go to school. Well, I do think there's a special relationship that women have to water, even in the more sort of modern world, because we know in many communities, more traditional communities, women still do, much more of the traditional work. But even where that's not so, I would argue that because we have children and because we give life and give birth and so on, I think there's a special relationship to water. And it's very interesting to me to see around the world that it's very often women who are the leaders in their community in fighting for the right to water, in fighting for a clean water source, and fighting against a polluter, a company, or fracking or whatever. I've watched women on the front lines of this issue in ways that I haven't in other issues, and I just think it's because of that very deep connection that women have to water and the immediate environment around them. With what we're dealing with invasive species with the Great Lakes is that only 3% of the aquatic life here is the original natural habitat, and that means that everything changes. That changes the bounce effect of the food chain and so on. But I come back to the need for laws. If our laws and our ethics said that we have to place the safety of the Great Lakes ahead of the commercial interests of the people and the corporations and the big ships coming in trading, then they wouldn't be allowed to bring their ballast and dump it, because we know that's where the invasive species are coming from. They'd have to stay out in the ocean, and you could have ships that are safe coming in and transporting the goods into the Great Lakes. I mean, opening up the Great Lakes in the first place to seagoing trade was done entirely as a commercial enterprise. And this is part of seeing the Great Lakes. Is this a body of water that gives life to all these people, or is it the living element of this this life-giving force, or is it just a big dollar sign? And I'll tell you, I think for too many people, including too many politicians, certainly for too many business people, that's just a great big dollar sign out there. Whatever they can get from it, whatever they have to dump in it, doesn't matter. It's just how much can we make. And so when they go to make rules, and again, Canada is the worst on this, way worse than in the US under the Harper government, when they go to make rules about shipping and ballast dumping and the way these big ships and the big trading take place on the lakes, it's like it's only about money and about trading. You can't interrupt that. The health and the safety of the lakes comes dead last. And that, unless that changes, unless that ethic changes, and I know I keep using this term about an ethic, but we have to have a fundamentally different ethic at the base of what we're doing here. And until we do, we're going to continue to see it as a resource for profit, for pleasure, for convenience, and not as an endangered lake. I mean, there's a fairly new study on groundwater taking around the world. It was done and coordinated by the UN, but with many research university and research institutions around the world. And they found that groundwater taking, because we now have the bore well technology to really go deep into the ground and pull this water up, right, is doubling every 20 years. And they said in this study that if the groundwater takings and the takings from the Great Lakes is taking place at the same rate as global groundwater takings, the Great Lakes could be bone dry in 80 years. This is a statistic that came from this international research project. So when I read that, I thought, well, that'll be on the front page of every newspaper in that region, right? It'll be top of story. No, it just, it's like we see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. We just can't look at that body of water and imagine that it could be gone. But there are other major bodies of water that are gone. The Aral Sea, Lake Chad in Africa. There are others that are mostly gone because of over-extraction and just this careless notion that you cannot destroy a water body of this size. So, I go back to this notion about, what matters most. And frankly, and certainly in our country under this government, but I have to say in many countries under many governments, it's just all about the economy. And it's all about increasing trade, more stuff, more fewer regulations, the less ability for governments to maintain environmental and health controls over the resources, so-called resources like these precious waters. Give them away in the name of commerce, in the name of trade, in the name of growth, this notion of growth at all costs. And we're seeing the result of it, and we're going to continue to see the result of it until we turn it around and say we have to find a balance here. And the balance has got to put these waters in the very center of our thinking and our lives and our policy making. Sustainable use of water and air and soil is the only way that it'll be here for generations to come, or maybe even just the next generation if, at the rate we're going. Well, this is a quote that makes us understand that we're connected to nature, and vice versa, that we're not some chain and we're at the very top and we're above everything else, that we're just an animal like other animals, and we have to find a way to live in a different and more compatible way with our world, with our natural world, because if we don't, I really feel, I don't mean to sound alarmist, but maybe I do. Having just finished writing a book with all these studies that come in and reports that come in, and I just reel from them, and I just want to say to the world to understand what we're doing to the world's water. I mean, I am deeply concerned about climate change too, but I think the first face of climate change is water, and the first face of climate change are water refugees, the people who can't grow food because there's no water, because we've got growing deserts in 100 countries in the world. Well over half the world has expanding deserts, because not just because of greenhouse gas emissions, but because of the removal of either vegetation from the soil, which means that the rains don't come back. You cut down a rainforest and the rain doesn't come back, right? I mean, it's called a rainforest for a reason. Or that you've removed the water, you've dammed the water, you've used it for for other purposes, and it's gone. And when it's gone, then everything heats up around it, because it's the circulation of water through the hydrologic cycle that keeps it, that keeps the air moist and cool, and tempers the air. And when you lose that, we see expanding deserts. And so I guess I want to sound the alarm, as I don't think it's too late. I think based on certain fundamental principles, I think we can have a water secure world, but it does mean a different set of priorities. It does mean really, truly challenging the notion of unlimited growth, challenging the notion and the power of these transnational corporations, challenging what I call the tyranny of the 1%, challenging the financialization of the markets and the financialization of nature, which is the latest thing, where even nature has to have a market value put on it or it can't compete for itself, right? It's a whole way of thinking that moves us into very dangerous new territory, when what we need to do is stop and reassess, and we can do this if we do it carefully. Well, I joke with people when they ask me that, say in a public place, and I'll say, well, I come and get you upset, and I give a speech and get you upset, and I feel all better. But that's actually true. I mean, doing something when you see something that isn't right, if you don't do something about it, in my opinion, it just eats at you. And I think it's really important to say I've got to take steps. And what gives me hope is the thousands, and I know there are millions of communities around, people in communities and projects around the world that are transforming the situation, that have declared water a human right in their community, that have come together to say no to destructive water practices, that have a vision for something different, that are using their artistic, perhaps they're poets, perhaps they're writers, perhaps they're painters, perhaps they're musicians, but they're in whatever way they are expressing something different and something new. And I think there's a new consciousness being created. I really do. When I talk to little kids, and I mean little kids, I don't mean just high school, young kids, there's a consciousness, there's a knowledge. They're banning, having their bottled water bans in public schools now. Certainly we've got lots of universities doing that, but the kids are coming home and saying to their parents, I don't want bottled water in my house because here's why, and here's how much plastic it uses, and here's what it's doing to the environment. So I feel a consciousness, and sometimes, I've lived through and was very involved in the women's movement at one time, and I watched the change, the jokes around violence against women and all of that stuff. That changed, and you see change around things like drinking and driving, or you see change around things like same-sex marriages and whatever. We can change. As a human species, we can evolve. And we need to evolve now in our relationship with nature, in particular our relationship with water. And that's the next step, to stop thinking that it just comes out of a tap and that we can do whatever we want with it and it's just here for us. To really, really change that kind of thinking is the big step. And I do see it happening. I really do. And that's the part that gives me hope. Well, I was very honored and proud to be a key part of that fight for the human right to water. I was there in the UN General Assembly on July 28th, 2010, when the UN voted, because of countries like Canada and Great Britain and the United States and so on not agreeing to a consensus that had to be put to a vote. And I had some of my staff with me, and I was holding their hands and saying that we're not going to win this today, but we'll win it in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. We'll be back. We won't give up. I really thought we were going to lose. And 122 countries voted in favor, and not one, even Canada, voted against. They abstained. That was their little protest. And the place erupted in cheers, and we got it. And it was just like, I'll never forget the moment as long as I live. And I felt at that point that as a human species, we had taken a step forward in our humanity, in our human evolution. It was just a really incredible day. So for me to be, for my legacy, for me to be connected to that, it is wonderful. I really feel that we have to put the environmental and ecological crisis together with the human rights crisis, because they're too separated. You get the environmentalists and the scientists over here warning about the ecological crisis, and then you have the humanitarian, social justice, human rights, development people over here talking about poverty, and it was, okay, well, let's just dig some more wells and that'll make it okay. Well, what if you're digging wells because all of the groundwater or the surface water has been polluted by an oil company or a mining company from my country? Is that okay? And just dig more wells where there isn't enough groundwater? If we don't put these together, we don't have a whole picture. I really feel actually that there are 4 fundamental principles upon which we have to build a water secure future. That water is a human right, that water is a public heritage, a common heritage of all of us, that water has rights too, and that water can teach us how to live together. And the teaching us how to live together means that we need to start saying that water can be the bridge to other issues of differences. If we have historic, religious, whatever disagreements, maybe even deep conflicts, maybe even historic wars, but all together our one water source is in decline, you know what, it really doesn't matter that you've got all those problems. You have to come together and fix that one. And so it's the whole notion of water as peacemaker, as peace builder is an incredibly important one.